Good morning, church. It's time for our weekly reflection, and I want to direct you this morning to another of the attributes of God, particularly His omnipresence. In previous reflections, I've directed your attention to the omniscience and the omnisapience of God, but today we want to look at another of His omni-attributes, that is, His omnipresence. Simply put, this means that at one and the same time, God is everywhere. To explore this truth with you, I want to direct your attention to Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12. This is what they say. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. David opens his 139th Psalm by discussing in verses 1 to 6 how God knows us intimately. He knows what we do in verse 2. He knows what we think, also in verse 2. He knows where we go in verse 3, what we say in verse 4, and what we need in verse 5. In the second stanza of David's song, he moves from God's omniscience to God's omnipresence. Again, that is, God is present everywhere. And as a result, He is with us continually. That's the theme of verses 7 through 12. One reason God knows us so intimately is because He's with us continually. The first stanza answers the question, how well does God know me? The second stanza answers the question, how near is God to me? David opens his thought with a question in verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Some have suggested maybe that David wanted to run away from such intimacy with God, expressed in the word flee. Perhaps the thought had entered his mind at some time or another. After all, the impulse to flee from God's presence is as old as the fall of Adam and Eve, when they sought to hide from God in the garden. But David knew God too well to think that he could flee from Him. He's just said in verse 5, you have enclosed me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. I don't believe the question that is here expressed has any intent of running from God. David didn't express any fear in verses 1 to 6 when he thought about God's detailed knowledge of him. On the contrary, he was so grateful for God's love and care, expressed in such intimate concern for him, that he breaks forth in worship. And even here in verse 10, he sees God's omnipresence as for his benefit. He says, your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. The question of verse 7 is a statement of joyful astonishment that God is in fact everywhere. David answers his question in verses 8 through 12, using his poetic imagination to envision three possible escapes that people may use to seek to flee from God, and showing in these three illustrations that nothing can hide us from God's presence, and indeed His presence is a blessing, even though we may not always realize it. He again, as in verses 2 and 3, uses the poetic device of naming two opposites to include both them and everything in between. He says we may go up or down in verse 8. We may go east or west in verse 9. In darkness or light in verse 11. But wherever we go, in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, He is there. In verse 8 he says, if I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. Wherever we may go, vertically up to the highest regions of space or down to the lowest depths of the earth, God is there. In the highest heaven, dwelling in the eternal abode, naturally we'd expect to find God. But even in Sheol, the Hebrew word for the place of the dead, even there we find God. Secondly, distance doesn't hide us from God. Look at verses 9 and 10. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. David is again using a geographic picture. We've already seen that there is no escape from God vertically. Now his imagination moves horizontally. The wings of the dawn refers to sunbeams. It's a poetic expression. If you've stood and watched the rising of the sun, you've noticed how its rays shoot across the heavens with the speed of light and reach to the farthest bounds of the horizon. Of course, to see the sunrise and the sunbeams at that time of the day, you're looking to the east. But then he speaks of the west when he speaks of the sea. As David would position himself in the Holy Land of Israel, the sun, of course, rising in the east, but then he would turn 180 degrees to the west and would find the boundary of land at the Mediterranean Sea. And so he envisions a world as far as one can imagine it, as far as the eye can see, reflecting the fullness of God's creation and where he is present one and the same time in all of it. David expresses his joy and confidence in our omnipresent Father in verse 10. Wherever we are, wherever we go, God's right hand, his hand of power, is there to guide and protect us. With his hand, God holds us fast. Finally, he observes that darkness does not hide us from God. That's the message of verses 11 and 12. How many have thought this way? Surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night. The thief feels comparatively safe in the night's darkness because no human eye can see them clearly. But God says in verse 12, even the darkness will not hide you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. This sentence answers verse 11 and emphatically negates any idea of hiding from God under the cover of darkness. The truth of God's omnipresence is a most frightening fact for the unbeliever, but a most comforting one to the Christian. No matter where we are, God is there. David finds the constant presence of God to be a comfort, a fact of peace, not a fact of fear. We are children of God no matter where we go. God our Father is with us. As he says in Matthew 28:20, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. This is a promise of God. Even when our situation seems dark and difficult, God is there with us and for us. He promises us, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. That's Isaiah 41:10. Maybe you are in a difficult situation right now. Maybe you've suffered some kind of loss, been afflicted with an illness or pain. Maybe the wound is still tender. Perhaps it's too early to know and understand fully what's happening. Perhaps you may never know this side of eternity. But believe David. Believe God. He has not left you.